This is a wonderful world in which we live. A world crowded with beauty, grandeur, and mystery. Yes, this is a wonderful world. But perhaps the greatest wonder of all is man himself. His body is a marvel of mechanical efficiency and adaptability. Man-made machines require lubrication from an outside source, but the body manufactures its own lubricant in the right grade and right amount for every part. The body has a chemical plant far more complex and efficient than any man has ever built. It transforms the food we eat into flesh and blood and bones and teeth. And the body has a heating system, a living furnace that we stoke daily with food for fuel. As this fuel is oxidized, heat and energy are provided for the body machine. An automatic thermostat controls both our heating and our cooling systems, keeping our temperature at a normal 98.6 degrees, except when a higher temperature is needed to combat disease. Still more wonderful is the human eye. The camera, man's nearest mechanical approach to the eye, resembles it in many ways. For any camera, whether it's a tiny model small enough to fit into your vest pocket, or a giant tracking camera, which photographs the details of the launching of a space vehicle, has a lens similar in design and function to the lens of the human eye. When a lens is focused on an object at a given distance and that distance is changed, the object becomes blurred and the lens must be refocused to the new distance. In the camera, this focusing must be done by hand, but in the eye, it's automatic. Strong muscles change the focus thousands of times each day without a thought on our part. Now, the pictures the eye gives us are not black and white. They're color pictures. And they're not stills. They're motion pictures. And they're not silent. They're sound pictures. Do you know that the music you're hearing is being played all over again on a perfect little musical instrument inside your ear? We think of the sound as being produced by the piano, and of course, in one sense, it is. But actually, the piano is as silent as a tomb and is merely producing vibrations in the air. As the keys are struck, felt hammers strike the strings, causing them to vibrate, each at its own frequency. The vibrating strings set the air pulsating to the same frequencies. These pulsations are transmitted to the outer ear, down the auditory canal, and through the mechanical linkage of the middle ear to the cochlea, which is all rolled up like a cockle shell. If the cochlea could be stretched out, we would discover a musical instrument similar to the piano, but far more wonderful and complex. The ear has more than 24,000 strings. When the piano is played, the ear's remarkable little keyboard plays the same tones and sends corresponding signals along individual lines to the brain. The outer ear operates in air, but the cochlea is filled with a liquid. The transmission of sound from air to a liquid is one of the most difficult problems known to science. But in the ear, this problem is beautifully solved by the mechanical preciseness of the middle ear, with its two diaphragms and three connecting bones with the exact leverage required. In the ear, these tiny bones, the ossicles, are exactly right for the job. They are a fixed size that must not change from the cradle to the grave. These are the actual bones from the ear of an adult and a child. Can it be just an accident that they are the only bones in a baby's body that do not grow, that are fully developed at birth? The ear is one of the most efficient sound detectors known to man, capable of hearing the roar of a cannon or the rustle of leaves, and under ideal conditions, even the footfalls of a cat. Scientists in the field of acoustical engineering have designed unusual rooms where it is possible to study the amazing sensitivity of the human ear. Prisms of spun glass absorb incidental sounds. Protected from outside noise, one can hear things he never heard before. The sound of air molecules beating against the eardrums. The sound of the heart pounding against the ribs. Did you ever see a living, beating human heart? This marvelous little pump pumps 12 pints of blood through hundreds of thousands of miles of blood vessels every minute. And in one day, pumps enough blood to fill a large gasoline truck to overflowing. During a lifespan, it would fill a string of tank cars 50 miles long and beat 2.5 million times without a single shutdown for repairs. Have you ever wondered what goes on in the brain of a homing pigeon? Somewhere within its tiny head is locked a secret no man has ever solved. A secret that enables it to take to the air long distances from home, circle about a few minutes, get its bearings in some mysterious way, and then fly straight home over long miles of unfamiliar territory. Because of the pigeon's strange homing ability, pigeon raising has become a popular hobby. As soon as the young are able to fly, they are released from the home loft on daily training flights. Like athletes, they must build up their speed and endurance through many weeks of strenuous training. Then, at last, the 500-mile race. At sunrise, Pigeondom's greatest race classic gets underway as thousands of experienced flyers take to the air. No one ever taught these birds the way home. No one ever showed them the path they should take. And yet, so unerringly do they wing their way across hundreds of unfamiliar miles that the time of their arrival home can be predicted almost exactly. But pigeons are small-time operators compared with the Pacific golden plover. It lives and mates in eastern Siberia and Alaska, but it winters in the Hawaiian Islands. In late summer, the adult birds make the long migration journey, traveling 2,000 miles over open sea. Without stopping for food or rest, they fly unerringly to these pinpoint islands in the vast Pacific. Junior's left at home because he's too young to make the trip. But many weeks later, as soon as he's able to fly, he too feels the urge to migrate, and he sets out for a goal he has never seen. To reach it, he must fly 2,000 miles over an unmarked path he has never traveled before, and the birds with him can't show him the way. They've never made the trip before either. But what prompts the golden plover to set out for a place he has never seen? Just think what would happen if his navigation were off and he missed those tiny islands. To keep a modern plane on its course requires an array of complicated instruments, tons of equipment, and a small army of highly trained men stationed along the course.
Runway 25 left, then make your left turn out at the shoreline. There'll be a jet departing behind you on runway 25 right. For 16 Bravo, I wanted you to fly westbound over 25 left. However, now that you started the left turn, continue the left turn out now. VFR midfield left turn.
And yet, in this tiny head, there is something that all the ingenuity of man cannot duplicate. Say, what's this? Something out of a nightmare? Could be if you dream of bats. The bat is a mysterious creature, the only mammal that flies. Like other mammals, it bears its young alive and suckles them at its breast. This is typical bat country. Only a bat could feel at home here. But rents are reasonable and bat apartments easy to find. That is, for bats they are. But scientists spend long hours searching for the bat hideouts. And the main object of their interest? The bat's remarkable abilities in flight. And then our official bat catcher swings into action in order that some of the bats may be taken to the laboratory for closer study. At the Moody Institute of Science, the bats quickly become adjusted to their new environment. Mickey was an orphan when we found him, but he quickly became the lab pet. Somehow he had his own ideas about food. Even a doll's nursing bottle wasn't much of an attraction at first. But it wasn't long before Mickey felt right at home with his bottle. In a few short days, the two were inseparable. But life isn't all nursing bottles in a science lab. There's work to be done, even for bats. These bats never served in the Army, but they know what an obstacle course is. The bat's wing spread far exceeds the space between the crossbars, and only clever maneuvering will permit him to fly between them. As the bat is released, we cross our fingers and hope he'll do what the book says. Now watch this. Bats are not blind. They have eyes and they can see. But the key to the bat's success in avoiding obstacles is not his ability to see. To prove it, we'll blindfold him and put him through another test. Blindfolded, he dodges those bars just as skillfully as he did before. But how does he do it? Well, science knows that bats emit strange cries in flight. They can't be picked up by the ordinary microphone. They're far beyond the range of the human ear. But a very special high-frequency amplifier, tuned to 32,000 cycles for this particular bat, translates these inaudible sounds into sounds we can hear. Bats' ears are extremely sensitive to high-pitched sounds. And the question arose, can the bat's own cries be signals that guide it in flight? Well, let's tie the bat's mouth closed so he can't make these sounds and see what happens. Science has proved conclusively that bats are guided in flight by echoes of their signal cries. That's actually a kind of radar. Man's radar takes tons of equipment and a large crew of men to operate. But the bat carries its remarkable radar around in its tiny head. Radar that guides it safely through the intense darkness of the caves, that keeps it from colliding with obstacles it cannot see, or with the thousands of other bats flying through the same darkness. Where did the bat get such marvelous equipment? Obviously, this is all a part of an intelligent plan, but whose intelligence? The bat's? If we were to visit the beaches of Southern California on certain spring and summer evenings, we'd find them dotted with campfires. But the people around these fires are not picnickers. Believe it or not, these folks are fishing. But now, here comes the lookout shouting, "Hey, Grunion, come on, come on!" And they're off in the strangest sport on earth. But wait a minute. Where's the fishing tackle? You can't fish without poles or nets, or can you? Fish out of water. Yes, and these fish haven't been washed up on the beach by accident. They deliberately come out of the water to lay their eggs on shore, the only fish in the world that spawn on land. Fish nesting on land, one of the rarest of all biological phenomena. A spectacle so unique it can be witnessed nowhere in the world except on a few Southern California beaches. Here, the female digs into the sand, tail first, and lays her eggs. Once they are fertilized, a desperate struggle for survival begins. If she misses the next wave, she has little chance to survive. The eggs are always laid when the water is far up on the beach. Then, night after night, the waters recede until they reach the lowest tide. By then, the eggs may be hundreds of feet from the water's edge, far from the element in which the fish must eventually live. Here the eggs develop, lying buried in the warm, moist sand. In the photomicrographic department here at the laboratory, the embryonic development, which normally takes place under the sand, is studied with the microscope. These eggs were fertilized only seconds ago, and now one is being prepared for observation. With the aid of the lapse time photomicrographic equipment, which compresses days into seconds, we will be able to witness this amazing spectacle, the magical unfolding of life through cell division. The first faint stirrings of life come when the blastodermal cap, seen in this circle, divides into two separate cells. In about 30 minutes, the second cleavage becomes evident, resulting in 4 cells. Successive divisions produce 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on up to hundreds of thousands of cells. This formless cluster is actually a fish in the making. It contains all the characteristics of the adult grunion, its size, its shape, its habits. Yes, even the germ of that mysterious wisdom by which it will someday be able to perfectly time its spawning with the movement of the tides. The first recognizable features are the head and the eyes. And the first action of the fish, controlled by its newly formed muscles, is revealed by the lapse time camera as a series of convulsive jerks. The head and the eyes are more plainly visible now. And on the opposite side of the egg, the tail is beginning to form. At this stage of its growth, the embryonic fish is 4 days old. The head and the eyes are well formed now, and the simple heart, already at work, can be seen. After 8 to 10 days, the egg is ready to hatch. But remember, when it does, it will be a fish. If it were to hatch while buried here in the sand, far from the water, it wouldn't have a chance in the world to live. But the grunion egg never hatches until the water reaches it, and then it hatches instantly. You can keep these eggs buried in the sand for weeks or months and they won't hatch. But now, let's pour some salt water on them and see what happens. This mysterious hatching of the egg is just as definitely connected with the movement of the tides as is the spawning. Suppose the eggs were laid any night before the peak tide. A higher tide the following night would wash them out and expose them to their enemies. Or if they were laid on a night too long after the peak, they would be washed out by a rising tide just a few nights later before they had a chance to develop. Actually, there are only a few nights when the grunion can lay her eggs successfully, when the tide is at its peak or the first few nights after the peak. And she must choose not only the right night, but the right hour of that night, even if she should lay her eggs on the right night. But when the tide is still rising, they would be washed out by that very tide. Or if she should wait too long after the peak and lay her eggs while that night's tide is receding, they would be washed out by the rising tide of the next night and destroyed. Only during this magic hour can the eggs be laid where they will develop safely. No sea captain can guide his vessel safely without a knowledge of the tides. But the grunion possesses a far better knowledge of the tides than the most experienced mariner, and is able to turn these tides to its own advantage, and by them preserve its very life and the life of its young. Remember that first garden you had when you were a youngster? You planted the seeds and covered them so carefully. You rather expected the plants to pop out of the ground like this, but somehow it didn't work out quite that way. As you waited, you got to wondering, maybe I planted those seeds upside down. Well, is there a right and a wrong end to a seed? On opening a bean seed, we find the embryonic root points in a definite direction. This determines the direction of initial growth. So it is possible to plant a seed upside down. But no matter which way the seed is placed in the ground, the plant always grows in the right direction. Even if we try to fool the growing seed, it doesn't get mixed up. The root reverses its direction and continues to grow downward. Now the shoot grows up because up is the place to find the light it must have. But if light can't be found by growing upward, the shoot will grow in any direction to reach it, even if it has to detour through a small hole to get there. Have you ever paused to consider the forces at work in a single tree? This tree is probably the oldest living thing on earth. It was almost 2,000 years old when Christ was born. For 3,800 years, this tree has been lifting at least 10 tons of water each day to its top, a total of more than 10 trillion foot-pounds of work. It is evident that there is an infinite power behind the mystery of life. But is this a blind, unintelligent, impersonal force? Well, you've been thinking, haven't you? That's all right. Don't feel embarrassed. It's a good thing. It's good to think once in a while about things like where you came from and why you're here, maybe about where you're going. How about that matter of origin? No doubt you formed some opinion as to where you came from. Let's look at it this way. Suppose that you've never seen and you've never heard of a watch. And then one day you find one. You're intrigued by its appearance and by that strange sound it makes. If you're anything like most of us, it isn't long before you have the back off trying to find out what makes it tick. You're still more intrigued by the intricate wonders of that mechanism. If you're observant, it isn't long before you notice that there's a definite relationship between the movement of those hands and the passage of time. And you find that you have a useful article. But now you've got to explain the origin of the watch. You might develop the theory that the watch just happened. especially if you're trying to convince yourself that nobody owned the watch. You could argue that the atoms and the molecules of the various parts just got together by accident. But the simplest kind of logic should tell you that somebody made those parts and somebody put them together for a purpose. How about that eye with its automatic focus? Or that tiny musical instrument inside the human ear? Or that heart with its endless capacity for work? Or the bat with its radar magic? Is all this the product of blind chance? You know, when you come right down to it, there are only two views we can take. Either all this happened by accident or it's the result of design and plan. You might just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's all a matter of personal opinion and let it go at that. You might, that is, but for the fact that this is an issue which vitally affects your whole life. It's going to determine how you think and how you live. For after all, if man is just an accident, then he has no responsibility except that which he chooses to impose upon himself. There's no law but the law of convenience and desire. There's no ultimate right or wrong. And when people think and live according to that philosophy, the result is chaos. But if, on the other hand, there's a plan, then there's a planner. If there's a design, there's a designer. In other words, there's a God. You know, it isn't hard to believe in a God. It's the simplest and the most logical thing in the world. Oh, I know. Some people are honestly confused by the maze of conflicting arguments. I guess they just try to make things too hard. For some people, the problem gets complicated when they begin to worry about who owns the watch. In other words, believing in God involves a responsibility. And they don't want that responsibility. They don't want anyone telling them what's right or wrong or how to live or act. Not even the God that made them. When you get as many people as there are in the world today living and acting as if there were no God, no wonder the world's in a mess. When we see the results of unbelief in the world today, it doesn't seem at all far-fetched to say that the only hope for the world as a whole or for you as an individual is faith in